So now that I've got all of this animated and the elements are all working, the bricks are forming, the truck builds and the Lego appears, I've got a couple more steps just to finish this off. I don't have any lighting in here yet, so I need to get on top of that. So what I'm going to do for this is just make a really simple physical sky. So under my Create menu, I'm going to go to Lights and create a physical sky. So this creates a whole sky system around my scene. Let's just jump out of the camera for a second. I've got a horizon, I've got a sky, and there'll be lights and shadows. There's a sun position. And if I go to my physical sky and its attributes, I've got some presets. And looking in here, I might use this hazy blue sky here. Just double click that, and now I've got a preset, and we've got some clouds, and that's looking pretty good. So if I jump into my scene here, maybe about halfway through, and just hit Shift R to do a test render. Got a whole bunch of test renders here from previous work on this, and what I can see here is I'm getting some shadows from the sun, and I can see that the shadows are falling onto the brick wall in the background here. Now, what I want to be really careful of is having these shadows hit the wall early on in the animation when the truck isn't assembled and the parts are sort of up out of the camera shot. One thing to be aware of in 3D always is where your lights and shadows are, and you know what your camera is actually seeing. So what I'm going to do is change the sun position a little bit so that the shadows fall in a slightly different direction. So it would be really nice if I could see my shadows in the viewport here just to get a better idea of what's happening. So if I go to my options menu and go down to shadows and turn that on, I'll get a rough preview of my shadows. So here I can see them coming from the physical sky, and as I scrub through the scene here, there's my shadows. And that's a little bit ugly down there. I don't really like that shadow sitting down there. So what I'm going to do is grab my physical sky, and the simplest way to change this is actually just to grab your rotate tool and rotate on this green y-axis and just shift the sun around until the shadows are heading in a direction that you're happy with. So what I was worried about before was if I scrub earlier into my timeline, here's my truck up here. I was worried about the sun possibly casting shadows from here down onto the wall here. So it looks like it's not too much of a problem, but I'm just going to turn that a little bit to make sure they're not hitting the wall. And let's scrub through the timeline, and what's that giving us? Shadows pretty much directly behind the truck. Let's have a look here. That's probably going to be okay. Yep, the shadows are building in behind the truck there. I'm fairly happy with that. Might just experiment a little bit. Maybe I could have them behind the truck in that direction a little more. Anyway, let's have a look. Maybe a little bit more straight on. I'm happy with that. And the other thing I just want to do is make sure I've got a little bit of shadowing across the actual truck itself as well, just to help to define the form of it. So I'm keeping my lighting super simple for this scene, and I'm just going to leave it with that physical sky with my shadows now in the right place. The other thing I can do is I could put a floor in my scene. At the moment there's no floor, so I'm not getting any shadows underneath the truck. It's just kind of floating in space, which is a little odd. So what I might do is go to my Create menu and go to Environment and create a floor. And a floor, it just looks like a square, but it's actually, it extends infinitely in all directions. So it's quite a useful object to use. So I jump back into my camera, and now actually let's just hop out for a second. We can see these shadows actually sitting on the floor now. And again, a smart thing to do here would be just to go back and scrub through and just check everything looks okay. And I haven't got any weird shadows now that I put the floor in. I'm fine with that. You can put a material or texture or a color on the floor if you want to. I'm just going to leave it as default for now. But that's looking pretty good. Okay, so nearly finished. If I just do one more test render here of my bricks flying in. Let's have a look at this, and as my render runs through, one thing I'd like to do is add a little bit of motion blur to my scene, because these bricks are moving really fast. They're all tumbling and spinning in really quickly, and it would look a little more natural. Excuse me, it would look a little more natural if we had some motion blur on there. So I'm going to turn that on in my render settings. So I can hit this little clapperboard with a gear icon, or I can hit Command B. And what I'm going to do is go to my physical section. I'm using the physical renderer and just turn on motion blur. I've got ambient occlusion turned on for a little bit of extra shading. And let's just do another test render of this. Now the motion blur will definitely slow down your renders quite a bit. My previous render I can see here from my picture viewer, my previous render was 19 seconds, and this one will probably take a little bit longer, but now we can see there's this nice motion blur going on with our objects. And we'll get it on the bricks here, and also I can see it starting to appear in these truck pieces as well. And that's all looking it's looking pretty smooth. I don't think I need to change the settings. There are a few settings for motion blur. If it's looking a little bit too liney, you can increase the subdivisions, but obviously increasing that will also increase your render time. But this is going to happen really quickly, so even though I can see a few little lines and it's not perfectly sort of smooth and blurry, I'm okay with that, because as I said, it's going to happen very quickly. So that definitely made a big impact on my render time. It doubled from 19 to just over 40 seconds. Again, I'm using an old Mac laptop, so you know, hopefully with a more modern machine, your render times will be a lot quicker. Also, I'm just using the physical renderer. I know there are other renderers out there, especially GPU ones, that are much quicker. But I'm just using all the standard tools that are built into Cinema 4D. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. That is ready to render. So I'm just going to go through my render settings now and make sure that those are all good. So again, let's just jump into here. I'm using the physical renderer. I'm rendering at standard HD, 1920 by 1080. Now I've normally work at 25 frames a second, but I forgot to set my project settings to 25. I've left it at 30. So I'm going to leave my frame rate in the render settings at 30 as well. So what's important is that these two numbers match, your project settings and your rendering settings. If these don't match, you're going to get some unusual timing issues going on once you've rendered your animations out. So 1920 by 1080, 30 frames a second. I'm going to render all the frames. So that's what I need to set in there. I'm just going to go and set a save value for this. I'm just going to make myself a folder on the desktop and make this Lego render and just name the individual files. Lego render. I'm going to use PNGs for this render. They're a pretty common file format. This is just a basic animation, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to turn on the alpha channel. I don't need the alpha channel for this. I don't need to composite this, but I always turn this on because it gives you the flexibility to, for example, change the background for something else later on if you want to. You can always ignore the alpha channel. I composite all my work in After Effects, so we can turn the alpha channel on or off in After Effects, but as a rule, I always turn this on when I'm rendering. It's always good to have an alpha channel available. Other settings, let's go through the physical settings, and I generally use the adaptive sampler on automatic, and I use this shading error threshold as a quality setting. The lower this value is, the better anti-aliasing and the less grain you'll have, but the longer your files take to render. I would recommend 10% or lower for this, for production renders. You know, down to 5% would be even better, depending on your computer hardware and your render time available. But this is a good ballpark for a good production quality render. One thing as well, if you are using ambient occlusion, it can be quite grainy, so it wouldn't hurt to increase the subdivisions, sampling subdivisions for your ambient occlusion. I'm just going to put mine up to 3. Again, for your own scenes, you'll need to experiment with these until you find settings that are the right balance between quality and render time. Okay, well that's pretty much it. So I can save my scene now, go to my render menu and add it to the render queue. I've got a previous render there, I'll just delete that one, that's an old one. And I'm just going to hit the go button and that will start to render. Now this could take a little while on my old laptop, so I'm going to leave it running, and the next section I will just compile it together in After Effects and Media Encoder.